Thank you, Miguel. Want to thank the organizer for inviting me to speak at this really exciting conference. I'm going to talk about a global perspective on dietary patterns and the chronic diseases, the role of olive oil. As Professor Walter Willett mentioned in the beginning of this conference, there has been a dramatic increase in global pandemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes in the past decades. Since 2000, the number of people with diabetes in the world has tripled. Right now, more than 450 million people in the world have diabetes, and this number will continue to increase in the coming decades. So by 2045, the number of people with diabetes in the world will increase to more than 700 million. And most of the increase in diabetes prevalence has occurred in low and middle income countries, especially in Asia, Africa, and South America. And this pattern will continue in the coming decades. For example, the projected increase in the prevalence of diabetes in Africa is going to be 100%. And in South America, it's going to be more than 60%. So this global pandemic of obesity and diabetes will have serious consequences, not just on public health, but also on economy. We know that genetics plays an important role in the development of obesity and diabetes, but the current epidemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes is certainly not driven by changes in our genes, but the changes in our environment and in our behaviors. And there's three transitions that are responsible for the current increase in prevalence of obesity and type 2 diabetes. Nutrition transition means a transition from traditional diet and lifestyle to westernized diet and lifestyle. And epidemiological transition means transition from malnutrition and infectious diseases to chronic diseases. But in many countries, there is a double burden of overnutrition and undernutrition. And demographic transition means that a transition from high fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality, which lead to accelerated aging in many populations. We are living in the obesogenic food environment, which is characterized by widely accessible, cheap, highly processed foods, sugary beverages, unhealthy fats, high amount of sodium, and wide availability of convenient and fast food, and reduced consumption of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legume, and fiber, and also increased portion size. A major feature of the nutrition transition in the past several decades has been the dramatic increase in meat production and meat consumption in the world. As you can see here, most of the increase has occurred in Asia and also in South America. And this increase in meat production and meat consumption has paralleled with economical development and nutrition transition, and this will have huge consequences on both public health and on environmental sustainability. As you can see here, even though economically developed countries like US still have the highest meat consumption per capita, low and middle income countries, especially Brazil and China, are catching up very quickly. Again, because of the large sizes of those countries and the increase in meat production and consumption in those countries will have huge worldwide consequences on both health and the environment. Many studies have shown that regular consumption of Western-style fast food is an important risk factor for obesity and type 2 diabetes. And this evidence comes from not just developed countries, but also for from developing countries. And regular consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages has been a major contributor to the global obesity and the type 2 diabetes epidemics. In our cohort studies, regular consumption of soft drinks is strongly associated with obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases. And here you can see that increased consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages is also associated with total mortality. On the other hand, regular consumption of tea and coffee in particular is associated with decreased chronic disease and mortality. And in terms of dietary fats, I think in the nutrition field, there is the consensus that all fats are not created equal. There are good fats and bad fats. The worst type of fat is a trans fat from partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. Saturated fat from animal products is not as bad as trans fat, but still it's associated with increased risk of chronic diseases and mortality. On the other hand, the good fats, monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, come from olive oil, from nuts, seeds, avocados, and from fish. One concern about Mediterranean diet and the high-fat diet per se, in particular, is increased weight gain associated with high-fat intake. However, in our studies and many other studies, eating healthy fats like monounsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat is not associated with increased weight gain, although overconsumption of unhealthy fats, especially trans fat and saturated fat, does promote weight gain. So again, when it comes to obesity, it's also important to distinguish good fats from bad fats. In the last several decades, the food sources of monounsaturated fat in the US diet have changed dramatically. In the 1980s and the 1990s, the major sources of monounsaturated fat, animal products, high-fat dairy, and meats. However, since the year 2000, olive oil has become the primary source of monounsaturated fat in the US diet. And other plant-based monounsaturated fat include nuts, seeds, salad dressing, and so on and so forth. And as Professor Willett mentioned earlier, regular consumption of olive oil has been associated with decreased risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and mortality in our cohorts, even though the consumption of olive oil in the US population is still much lower than that in European countries. Consumption of olive oil instead of butter or other animal fats has beneficial effects on chronic disease prevention and also on longevity. On the other hand, animal fats, including dairy fats, are not optimal in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, even though dairy fat includes some beneficial fatty acids, such as some transisomers or arch-chain fatty acids. Most of dairy fats are still bad fats. Those are long-chain saturated fatty acids, which are associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and increased LDL cholesterol levels. Like dietary fats, different type of proteins have different effects on health outcomes. In our studies, regular consumption of animal protein is associated with increased chronic disease and mortality. On the other hand, higher consumption of plant protein is associated with decreased risk of chronic diseases and decreased mortality risk. A new technology called metabolomics has demonstrated that eating animal protein-rich diet can produce harmful small molecule metabolites such as branched-chain amino acids, TMAO, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you eat a plant protein-rich diet, there is an increased production of healthy small molecule metabolites that you can measure in blood samples. And those studies have developed unique metabolic signatures for animal protein-rich diet versus plant protein-rich diet. Many studies have shown that higher consumption of red meat, especially the processed red meat, is a risk factor for diabetes, heart disease, and some cancers, especially colorectal cancer. In our cohorts, we found that if you replace red meat with other protein sources, such as fish, chicken, or some plant-based protein foods, like nuts, soy, and other legumes, there is a significant benefit in reducing chronic diseases and the total mortality. We estimated that about 10% of premature deaths in men and 8% premature deaths in women could be prevented if everyone in the U.S. Consumed fewer than half serving per day of red meat. The current consumption is about 1 to 1.5 serving per day of red meat. If everyone could reduce their consumption by half, then almost 10% of premature deaths could be prevented. The evidence is very clear that eating plant-based foods, such as fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains, coffee, and tea is beneficial for metabolic health and longevity. However, not all plant-based diets are healthy. So if you eat a plant-based diet with high amount of refined grains, sugary foods and beverages, and high glycemic foods, this kind of plant-based diets can actually increase risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Recently, we identified a metabolic signature for healthful plant-based diets, and this signature can be used to monitor the adherence to a healthy plant-based diet, and also can be used to predict future risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Every 5 years, the US government releases dietary guidelines for Americans. In 2015, the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee conducted a comprehensive literature review on diet and environmental sustainability. And the committee concluded that a plant-based dietary pattern is not just beneficial for human health, but also for the health of the planet. But of course, the plant-based dietary patterns do not need to be a vegetarian diet or vegan diet, although some people may choose to follow a vegetarian diet or vegan diet. Other plant-based dietary patterns include the traditional Mediterranean diet, the traditional Asian diet, or the DASH diet. So it means that a plant-based dietary pattern can be tailored to individual health conditions and cultural and food preferences. And the plant-based dietary pattern recommended by the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee is similar to the Plan-Forward dietary pattern recommended by the Manual of Change organization. So when we develop dietary guidelines, it's important to consider both health outcomes and also environmental impact of individual foods. Here you can see that for 4 different disease outcomes, colorectal cancer, coronary heart disease, stroke, and diabetes, the health effects of individual foods align very well with the environmental impact of those foods. So for foods are detrimental to the environment, especially red meat and processed meat, they are also very detrimental to human health. On the other hand, plant-based foods, especially fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and also olive oil, are not just beneficial for the environment, but also beneficial for a wide range of health outcomes. So when we talk about olive oil and other foods, it's important to look at several dimensions of sustainable nutrition. Of course, we want to make sure that those foods are beneficial in terms of human health and disease prevention, and they're also beneficial for the environment. At the same time, we want to ask the question whether those foods are accessible, economically fair, and affordable for most people. And also want to ask the question whether the food is culturally acceptable. And when it comes to olive oil, I think it's really important when we conduct studies or make recommendations in non-European countries, we want to ask a question whether it is culturally acceptable to those populations. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.